combine this with investment. Now, let me start with the crisis scene. What happened really with Greece was a combination of two factors. Greece found itself, partly due to the global crisis, but very much due also to unwise management of the national wealth, in a situation where it was combining two negative conditions. On one hand, we had a budget deficit that was going up to 12.9% of GDP, almost 13% of GDP, which is a very high number by any standards and an exceedingly high number by European standards. The second problem was a public debt that was reaching about 114.7, almost 115% of GDP, which is also a very high number. Now, you could find any of these two things happening one at a time in many EU countries, but what you wouldn't find was the combination of the two. And this is what actually made Greece an easy target, I could say, for speculative scenarios. And in that, the speculation was not only against Greek economy, but it was over the Eurozone and the Euro itself. Now, the reaction of the Greek government to that was, and the personal involvement and effort of the Greek Prime Minister, George Papandreou, was to try to build an EU support mechanism for that. And he was successful in that, although it took more time than we thought it should have taken for internal reasons of the European Union. But the results were twofold, and they were important. On the one hand, for Greece, it meant that the Greek economy was safe from the speculative and aggressive stance of markets, so that we could move on with the development side of the economy. And for the European economy itself, it was a strong signal to the markets that the Euro and the Eurozone is fully backed and not prone to speculative scenarios. On its part, the Greek government, what we did was to adopt a program of stability and growth with three targets. The first target was to control public spending because it was excessive. The second was to increase public revenue through a tax reform that we have installed and implemented, and we're already having results of that. And the third was to really start again the machine of productive investment. And this is where we come to the second point. Because I think that the recipe for crisis is not only bad management of public funding, but it's also how the public sector, besides overspending, can become inefficient in how investment happens in a country. So investment, when it is non-productive, meaning that it either has low return or that it creates a bubble nature of investment. And that's very important to retain, because a bubble nature of investment can create a case where you might have a high revenue for a short period of time, but then it leads to problems. So what we're trying to do, and what we have very much focused once we have put in place a system for the support mechanism from the European Union, the IMF for Greece, is to attract investment that is productive. And I'm using the Greek example here because I think that this is one case that is very characteristic on what we can see in other parts of the world, because the crisis is not over, we know that. And we need to turn into investment that will become productive. What we have established as a vision for Greece for investment and for development is what we call green development. And that means putting to value the comparative advantages of the country and making sure that investment will be producing good results and good returns for the years to come, for a long time. One example for that is energy, for example. We have started our cooperation, and we have announced a few weeks back a first agreement with Qatar, actually, for the establishment of an energy hub in Greece that will not only be important for Greece, but for the whole coordination and movement of energy between Greece, the Gulf, and the European Union and the surrounding area. That also includes our vision for the development of networks, either gas or electricity, and of course, as the prior speaker said, the renewables, renewable energy. And I have to add here that actually Greece is, if you take into account also geothermal energy, probably the richest part of the world in renewable energy. And we want to be the entry point, not only for our country, but for actually advancing this agenda throughout the European Union. And as you know, this is an issue of energy security, because the European Union is the leader in the fight against climate change, which means that the European Union will be the one supporting the taxing, if I may say so, or payments in a more general term, of emission standards. And that could mean that if emission standards are paid for by those that produce the energy, that could increase the price of kilowatt hour by numbers as high as up to 30%, which is definitely a problem for development. Now, this is why we are trying to focus on new ways that energy can be produced, more efficient ways that energy can be transferred, for example, from the Gulf to the European Union, and for new ways of using more efficiently energy. Same thing holds for shipping, for railways, for airports, for transport in general. And of course, in a case of a country like Greece, one would have to look into one or two specific cases like tourism development. We consider tourism development in Greece very important, but again, in a situation where we don't go for opportunistic tourism development. And I think that in investment, one has to look into that very much. Like the same case goes with real estate development, people have to look into investments that create something that has a long life, that produces results in the long term and works for the benefit of all. And a final example that I would like to bring up is the case of food. It was brought up by previous speakers again. In the Mediterranean region and in Greece specifically, we have one advantage, that is that this is the birthplace of what everybody knows as the Mediterranean diet, which is not only to produce more, but mostly to produce higher quality, to produce better. And this is also one case in which we believe that investment is highly needed so that we can reap the best benefit and the best results out of cultivation of the land. To do all this, it's not only enough to have a vision for green development or for which other sectors, but you need, as you said very correctly, to have a case in which the legal background and the procedural background is one that allows investment to happen, to have its returns, to be regulated, but also to be flexible and productive, to be quickly moving. In Greece, what we have done is that we already changed a number of laws, and we are still doing quite a lot of work in, first of all, changing the legal background, for example, on how we develop renewable energy sources, on how we make the entrepreneurship become less burdened by bureaucracy. So where you had before to go through 25 steps for a permit process, now we go to the one-stop shop, as we say, for investment, and also give the right incentives to the markets to come and do this in Greece, but understanding that when we're talking about Greece, we're talking about the general geographical position, because one should remember that a country like Greece is standing between the Balkan areas, the Western Europe countries, and the East Mediterranean, which, again, as was said, is a very important producer of energy, of culture, of goods. Now, I think that in a time of crisis, one has to try to see the positive side. And the positive side is that, in my reading, a crisis and a financial crisis came as a cold shower, as a cold bucket of water that said, wait a minute, what are we doing with investment in our countries and in our economy in total? Have we invested the global wealth in things that produce more good, more wealth, but more well-being at the same time for the people? And the answer is no. This is why we have a crisis, because we've had bubbles exploding here and there. And what we need to focus on is to focus on the development that is really taking into account the big challenges of the future. And the big challenges of the future is not just the economy. It is energy and climate change. It is food production. It is, of course, the movement of people and the movement, immigration or illegal immigration, that is related to the previous things. And these are the axes on which one has to start thinking about the next steps towards development. We are doing this part, and the good news is that we see that investors from all over the world, because we are in touch with investors from the Gulf, we're in touch with investors from Northern Europe, from the United States, from Russia, from China, we see that what makes most attractive one country for development is to have a vision, not only to produce good internal return rates, because that is of course important and it has to be taken into account, but also to have development that produces a future. And this is what attracts investment. So I think that our way out of the crisis is not to say that we need to mobilize as much money as we can, as fast as we can, but to know what we want to do with it. And I think that our example will, and I'm quite confident with that, give an example on how we do it. So with these words, again, thank you very much for your invitation and for your understanding for my late arrival.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greece.